Okay, this is Martha Smith, and I'd like to invite or welcome you all to our second part of our webinar series, The Good, the Bad, and the Lovely. If you joined us 2 weeks ago, we started this series talking about some common invasive species. Kari Houle and Andrew Holtzinger, educators in the Central Region, presented what we as a team identified as some invasives that need to be considered and looked at in our landscapes. The second part of that program was Rhonda Faree and Chris Unroth, and they talked about some control strategies. Tonight, what we want to continue with is we're going to talk about some landscape alternatives that we've researched to get you to think about adding these to your landscape or possibly replace some things that you already have in your landscape. Jennifer Fishburne and myself will be presenting that. And then the second part will be pollinator plants, and Kelly Alsep and Ken Johnson will be presenting that part of the program. Each of the sessions will probably run about 35 minutes or so, and we'll allow for questions and answers in between and again at the end. So I hope you're seeing the screen, the good, the bad, and the lovely. The first part is landscape alternatives. Jennifer Fishburne and myself will be presenting this. And I'm going to start out with, okay, Kari, thank you. I'm going to start out with some definitions that we talked about 2 weeks ago, just to kind of get everybody rethinking about what we're wanting to discuss. Invasive, with respect to a particular ecosystem, any species that is not native to that ecosystem, including its seeds, spores, or other biological material capable of propagating that species, and whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm. And this is a definition from the Illinois Invasive Species Council. We all understand what's invasive, but we also are becoming aware of some species that are in our landscapes and are available through the trade that are starting to show some potential to being invasive. So the species of concern, non-native plants that may have the potential for becoming invasive, and therefore care should be taken to monitor this species and look toward alternatives. And that's what we're going to be talking about the first part of this evening's program. I also, when I look at what is native, the definition, there seems to be a lot of not a good consistent definition. But the definition I have up here is from the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and they have a really good reference book, Native Alternatives to Invasive Plants. And how they define it is a plant that occurs naturally in a particular region, ecosystem, and/or habitat without direct or indirect human interaction. A plant endemic to Europe and introduced to North America is not native to this continent, and a plant native to one region of North America is not native to another region unless it originated there without help from us. So that's just kind of a little review of what we talked about last week to get us thinking about plants of concern, invasives, and what the alternatives are. When Jennifer and I were researching this, we tried to look at several lists that are out there. We just didn't rely on one source. So we looked at several. So the plants that we are presenting tonight are in no way definitive and inclusive. I mean, there's many, but we tried to select the ones that were common throughout all. When you're buying a plant, we read a lot of plant descriptions, and, we always joke that we wish that the plant had read that description. So when you're looking at plants, do your research, because a lot of times in catalogs and in magazines, those descriptions, part of it is to entice us to buy it. But you might want to think and do your research to say, Do any of these have any potential problems? Is there something else maybe I should be considering? And tonight, as we present all these alternatives, not all of them are native. So there are a few that are good plants, but they're not going to be native to North America. Here we have the 6 that were identified. We talked about these last week. Kari and Andrew talked about the identification feature. The bush honeysuckles, and it's not just Lonicera maackii. There's a couple others. But we also have Callery pear, the winged euonymus, which is burning bush. We also have the winter creeper euonymus, purple loosestrife, and Oriental Bittersweet. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, and she'll talk about the first 3.
On this screen here, as Martha mentioned, we're going to talk about the 6 that were talked about 2 weeks ago. And the first one we're going to address is what would be some alternatives to Lonicera maackii, the Amur honeysuckle or bush honeysuckle. I think it's important to note that this one is no longer sold in the industry, although I did see it at a plant sale where people dig things up out of the yard and sell them, and it was incorrectly labeled. So it is possible to get it from some sources. But what I thought interesting about this plant is it was actually introduced in the United States in 1897, and Morton Arboretum warned that it had invasive potentials in the 1920s. So I think it's very interesting. This plant, while we think maybe more recent history, has been in the United States for some time. What the issue is here is it has allelopathic chemicals which keep other plants, particularly natives, from coming up in our woodlands. So our first alternative suggestion here is serviceberry. And why we like this plant so much is it's considered a 4-season plant. And 4-season means it has something of interest during each one of the seasons, spring, summer, fall, and winter. This is also called Juneberry. It's a small tree that can get 20 feet tall, average, but can range from 15 to 25 feet tall. What's an added bonus is the fruits are not only edible to humans, but also to wildlife. You can see in the photos here that we have some very showy white spring flowers and a great fall color in the oranges and reds. Again, it not only is attractive to us, but it's attractive to birds for their fruits. And it will tolerate clay soils. This is, to me, just an all-around great plant. Here we see the gray bark, which is giving us the winter interest. The berries, which have a resemblance to a blueberry, although they don't get that blue color, and then the fall color.
Grace?
This next slide here, we have deciduous holly. And deciduous holly is native to eastern North America. It can range anywhere from 3 to 12 feet, but usually averages around 6 feet tall and wide. What's nice about this plant is it can grow in a range of soil types, from average to a medium to a wet soil, and it does like acidic soils as well. It'll perform best in full sun to part shade, and you can see that the female plants give us a beautiful red berry that persists into the winter. And I said female, in order to get red berries, you'll need both a male and a female plant. This is another photo of the great fruit that this plant produces, which again, as you see in the top right, can persist into the winter after the leaves have fallen. This is Beautybush, and Beautybush is native to China. And what I found interesting about this as well is we're saying not to plant the bush honeysuckle, but this is a member of the honeysuckle family. Difference being this one has not shown the invasive properties that our bush honeysuckle has. This one will grow 6 to 10 feet tall and about as wide. And it has a pink bloom from April to May. What's nice about this one, and an added benefit, is it does tolerate, I should say tolerant to deer, meaning deer don't like to eat this plant. And this is one that can be grown in a clay soil. This one is one that will benefit from either thinning, which means removing some of the older stems each year, or every several years to cut it all the way to the ground, because it can get kind of leggy. Another nice feature of this plant is it does have an exfoliating bark. And here we see the fall color. Arrowwood Viburnum is, again, native to Eastern North America. As Martha mentioned, we can't give you all the options, but two other viburnums of note are Blackhaw and Nannyberry. They're native to Illinois species. As you can see on the slide here, this one gets about 6 to 10 feet tall. What's of, I think, very nice interest is that it has showy blue berries, not blueberries that we eat, but blue berries that do persist again into the winter, and they're attractive to the birds. This one, again, likes full sun to part shade in a well-drained soil, and it has a really nice fall color of yellow to orange or red. And of interest, while researching a little more on this plant, I found that it got its name because the Native Americans used the straight stems for arrow shafts. And here we see the blueberry fall in the late summer into fall. Callery pear is our next species of concern. And again, this is native to China. As a cultivar, if you have just straight cultivars, they do not create fertile seeds, but when two cultivars cross, they produce a viable seed that then has invasive potential. This one is not listed on the Illinois invasive species list, but this is one that we call a species of concern because it is creeping rapidly into open fields, open areas, roadways, in areas where this has been planted. Also, just to note, as we said, we can't cover everything, but other suitable alternatives to this would be dogwood and redwood. This is white French tree. It is native to eastern United States. I particularly love the white flowers that you see here. They have a very airy look to them in the spring, and then that goes to a bluish black fruit during the summer. And then in the fall, we have this brilliant yellow fall color. This is a plant that'll get 12 to 20 feet tall and about as wide. Does prefer moist, fertile soil and tolerates sun and shade. Excuse me, sun and part shade. And as Martha mentioned here, very fragrant flowers as well. Next, we have Carolina Silverbell. This is a small tree getting about 20 to 40 feet tall. Of real special interest in the spring, this has a bell-shaped flower that hangs down like a bell. It's white in color. This will usually grown as a multi-stem shrub, but it could be a single tree, but generally you'll see it more as a multi-stem shrub. Growing in full sun to part shade, preferring acidic moist soils, but it will grow in a variety of soils as well. And that's Carolina Silverbell. And this is the white flower, bell-shaped flowers showing with the previous season's fruit hanging from the branch as well. Our next species here that as our species of concern is the winged Euonymus, also known as burning bush. This was planted, as you can see from the photo, for its bright red fall color. Again, another native to China. And interestingly enough, it was introduced in the 1860 as an ornamental shrub. The birds will eat the fruits, and then that gets distributed, the seeds get distributed widely across woodlands and roadsides, and it will outcompete our native plants. So some suggested alternatives. We'll start off with black chokeberry, which is a native to Illinois and eastern North America. This plant will grow about 4 to 6 feet tall and wide. It has very pretty white flower clusters in the spring, and that will go into clusters of glossy blackberries, as the name indicates, black in the name. The chokeberry part of the name comes from the fact that while the fruits are edible, when you bite into them, they give you an astringent that will actually cause you to choke. So it has been that people do use it in jams and jellies, where you can, add sugar to it and give it a little bit better flavor there. This is used best in naturalized areas because it does tend to sucker. You'll need to, if you're putting it in a landscape, you'll need to make sure you remove the root suckers to prevent it from spreading too far.
Oh boy.
This is a picture of the berries and the fall color as it's coming on. Next we have red chokeberry. Again, very similar to the black chokeberry. This one will get about 10 feet tall and 6 feet wide. Again, a multi-stemmed shrub that you might want to remove suckers from at the base if you don't want this to naturalize. As the name indicates, it'll get a glossy red berry, and it has actually a red to a burgundy fall color. This one will do well in full sun or part shade and does tolerate wet soils. This is a photo of the fall color and the fall berries. Dwarf Fothergilla, if we can make personal notes here, this is probably one of my favorite shrubs for the landscape. As you can see, the little white ball-shaped or bottle brush-shaped flowers have a fuzzy look to them in the spring. This plant will grow about 3 to 5 feet tall, sometimes closer to the 5 foot. This is one you can also make the plant a little, keep looking nice by removing some of the older stems at times. While this does prefer acidic soil, it will do well in moist, rich, well-drained soil. And this is another 4-season interest plant with the spring flowers and then the fall color, and the stems actually have a very nice winter look to them. The fall color on this is outstanding. It's usually a very nice yellow, combination of yellow, red, and orange. These are 2 other additional photos of Dwarf Fothergilla. And the left you have the fall color, and in this case it's a red to a purple. And on the right we have a cultivar called Blue Mist, which does have a very pretty blue cast to it. This is Eastern Wahoo, which is another native to Eastern North America. This plant, as it indicates, is a euonymus, and it gets 12 to 20 feet tall, about the same spread. What's really an identifier on this one is the dark purple blooms in June, and then the showy red berries that you'll see in the fall. The berries are not only of interest to us in color and what they look like, but also very attractive to the birds. This is a really pretty red fall color, and can grow in full sun or part shade. And here we have a picture of the flowers. This is a photo of Highbush Blueberry. Blueberry is one of 3 native fruits to North America, and this particular one is native to eastern North America. Blueberries, to do well, prefer an acidic soil. However, they will produce in a little bit higher pH, but they will not thrive near as well. This is a very shallow rooted plant and does benefit from mulching. Again, this is best planted in full sun. It will tolerate part shade, but if you're looking to get fruit, full sun would be the best location. Another great 4-season interest plant, as it has pretty white bell-shaped flowers in the spring, glossy green leaves in the summer, and a really pretty orange-red fall color. It is recommended that if you want to do this plant this for fruit production, that you look for one of the cultivars that's been bred for producing the berries, and not the straight species. Again, this is the beautiful fall color that it has. Turn this over to Martha. Martha, were you taking this one? Or no, I am, sorry.
No, I'm sorry, I was on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Next plant is Winter Creeper Euonymus, Euonymus fortunii. We already looked at the burning bush, which is another Euonymus. And this plant here was very desirable at one time because it was an evergreen ground cover, it was shade tolerant, but then it began to take off, and it has been known to, cover plants and really spread and escape. Some of the alternatives that we looked at, the two that we decided to discuss tonight, are the wild ginger and the hellebores. The wild ginger, Asarum canadense, is a low-growing plant, about 1 foot tall. They can spread to 1.5 feet, 2 feet. It will also tolerate the same, light conditions as the Euonymus. It can tolerate partial shade to full shade. And this really is a low-maintenance plant. The foliage is slightly pubescent or fuzzy compared to the European ginger. If you have that one, it is even a lower ground hugging plant, and it has a very shiny, glossy leaf. And this one is native to the eastern United States. What's interesting is that we're showing you here in that one picture, that's the flower, but the flower, it shows up below the leaves, very close to the ground, and in some instances, if you don't look for it, you really don't see it. The other alternative was the hellebore, the Lenten rose, and there's a lot of different hellebores that are out there. A majority of them, about 1.5 feet to a 1.5 feet. They do have some evergreen tendencies, I think more so when you get into the southern part of the state. But what we like about our hellebores is that they bloom early. They actually are probably coming into bloom now in southern Illinois, and then by the time that it gets closer to late March, early April for northern Illinois. And there's many colors. We're showing you here a couple of the pink shades, but there's been a lot of introductions in the past 6-7 years or so. are also known to be deer resistant, and for those of you that have shade, that live in wooded areas, this can be a real bonus. As we said in the beginning, not all the alternative plants that we're discussing tonight are native to North America. This plant is native to Europe and Asia. The next plant is purple loosestrife, and I hope the majority of you have become familiar with this and do realize, you know, it has escaped into especially wetlands and is really a problem in states such as Wisconsin and Minnesota, where they have a lot of lakes and water areas. It had a nice long bloom season. It tolerated wet soils, but then it started to take off. What I have found in my research is there were male sterile introductions made. These were supposedly vegetatively propagated, but somewhere along the line they started to produce viable pollen and they started to cross with the Lythrum salicaria. So the alternatives that we have, the first is swamp milkweed. And for those of you that are monarch butterfly fans, you all know how important the milkweed is for the monarchs. The swamp milkweed has showy, fragrant pink flowers. It blooms for a good 4 to 6 weeks, usually late July into August. Full sun. Medium to wet soils, but I found once this plant gets established, it can tolerate some dry conditions. And as you see here in the picture, it's attracting the monarchs. The monarch female lays eggs on milkweed. That's the primary larval food, and that's why having milkweed is so important to the survival of the monarchs. And this is native to northeastern United States. Here, just showing you some other pictures of the flowers. Nice plant. The picture on your right showing you just the buds are opening up, and then of course the flowers, they're in full bloom. The other plant that we chose was cardinal flower. Mainly because it can also tolerate the medium to wet soils that you found the Lythrum growing in. Full sun to part shade, about the same height, about 2 to 3 feet tall. This does have more of a true red color, where the Lythrum had more of a fuchsia pink color to it. It does offer us a long period of bloom. After it's done with its first bloom, deadhead it, cut the flower stalk off. You often will get a second flush of color, though not as prolific as the first. And with its red color, as you can assume, hummingbirds are attracted to it, as well as numerous butterflies. The large-flowered Beardtongue, this is a Penstemon, gives you the lavender flower color. It's going to bloom earlier than the ones we've shown you already. It's going to come into bloom usually end of May into June. Tolerates full sun, and deer don't seem to prefer it. At least that's what we found in our research and what Missouri Botanic Garden reported. So here you have something getting closer to those color tones of the Lythrum, and it will give you an earlier bloom. Ironweed Vernonia. This is a nice plant. This is a tough plant. It has the magenta pink flowers, a long period of time. Don't be afraid to deadhead this one. You'll get a second flush of color. It can get a little bit taller than Lythrum. It can push up, especially if you have it in a moist area, it can reach up to 4 feet tall. And it's a native to central United States. There it is, just showing you they're blooming. The last one that we're going to talk about is the Oriental Bittersweet. And 2 weeks ago, when we had the introduction with Kari and Andrew, they talked about the differences between the Oriental and the American Bittersweet. The one that is showing the invasive tendencies is the Oriental, and as you can suspect, it is native to Japan and China. And one of the ways to tell the difference, the picture on your left, the Oriental will have fruit all along that stalk, where the American sets fruit at the tips. And I just wanted to have pictures to show you that this evening. The other thing is the color of the fruit. The American bittersweet tends to stay more in the orange tones, where the Oriental has that two-tone, more of a lighter golden color with the orange. Now, unfortunately, craft people and wreath makers tend to like that two-tone look, but that's the one that's really showing the invasive tendencies. So the American bittersweet, and then we have Dutchman's pipe. The American bittersweet, it is native to North America. It's a woody climbing vine, can easily reach 15 to 20 feet. It prefers full sun, but it will give you a decent display in partial shade. I think Andrew did a really good description 2 weeks ago about the foliage. This has more of a rounded leaf compared to the Oriental. It has the berries, attracts birds, yellow fall color, and it's native to North America. The Dutchman's pipe, this is a deciduous climbing vine. This one, you cut it back in late winter. It tends to be more of an herbaceous plant, but it will cover a large area fairly quickly. So if you're looking just for a vine to cover, then this would be definitely one to choose. It has these unusual, and I really don't know how to describe it. They say resemble the Dutch smoking pipes. Sometimes I can see it and sometimes I can't. But they're a yellowish green, about 2-inch long flower. And as I said, it does provide a very quick cover, and it is native. That's our part of the program. We just wanted to give credit to the photos that we received. Here, a list of the references that we used. The third one from the bottom, the Native Alternatives to Invasive Plants, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden All-Region Guide. I particularly find that one very helpful when looking for plants to select to replace these invasives. So that's our part of the program. Do you have any questions?
At this point, please feel free to type questions into the chat box and we'll make sure to get those answered. Or if you're calling in on a phone line, *6 will unmute your phone and you can ask your question via phone.
The hardiness zone for Dutchman's pipe, it's hardy for us. Let me go back. Oh, we didn't put that on. Dutchman's pipe does grow here. They have it, I know they're growing it in a couple gardens in central Illinois. Not sure about getting up into Wisconsin, though. We might be getting close to its northern range, but I do know it grows in central Illinois and does well further south. The question, deciduous holly the same as winterberry? If I'm remembering correctly, I believe there's a cultivar of deciduous holly called winterberry, but I think it's a cultivar. So that would
it's actually Ilex verticillata is the winterberry.
That is the winterberry. Okay. Okay. What about pH values? For which plants? I think Jennifer addressed the blueberry, which tended to prefer the acidic soils. I mean, we've presented a variety, so I guess I would just need more detail. Fringe.
Sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead, Martha.
Oh, fringe tree. Well, the pictures of the fringe tree, those are in my backyard, and I see it every day. It has the one more of a rounded shape, a very nice gray, kind of a grayish bark to it, a light-colored bark. Kind of a coarse texture to it. I've had that plant for about 18 years, so I can't say it's a fast grower. It's probably now about 15 by 15 feet.
There's a question here that I'll get to, but to answer the question on the Dutchman's pipe, it does say it has a zone of 5 to 8. So
okay.
Will do well in central Illinois, but may not do so well in northern Illinois.
Yeah. Yeah.
The next question is, can the Fothergilla grow in alkaline soil, and does it handle part shade? The answer is yes to both. While it prefers acidic and will do a little better in acidic, I have mine in alkaline soil, and they grow just fine. Part shade is acceptable, but what I will tell you is in full sun, it's a much prettier plant, more compact. In part shade, mine gets a little bit leggy.
Mm-hmm. The next question, should I remove burning bushes from my home landscape? That's definitely an option for you. If you're especially seeing some of the invasive reseeding qualities of it. We tried, Illinois is a long state, and we have different weather extremes. We really did try to look at plants that should do well throughout most of the state. Jennifer, you can jump in. That's what we tried to do. I know with the hellebore, the blooming time is much earlier than northern Illinois, but for the most part, we tried.
I would agree. We tried to pick species that could be grown throughout most of Illinois. I can't guarantee that on every single one of them, but we tried to look for that. The next question is, can the male flowers of any holly fertilize any female holly? I want to say no. Any of the hort educators have an exact answer to that, Martha?
Well, I know that when you look to purchasing them, they will say you have to have this pollinator, but I really think it's more timing, that you want to have the male and the females blooming at the same time.
Correct.
Yeah, you could have a male and a female, but if they're not blooming at the same time, they're not going to connect. So I think that's more the issue, is the flower timing.
The next question says, I have common milkweed. Is swamp milkweed better for the butterflies? I think that Kelly will probably address that in the next session, but swamp milkweed just, I think, has a nicer appearance for the typical landscape than common milkweed, but they both would work just fine.
The swamp milkweed is a perennial. There is the tropical milkweed, which I believe is incarnata. That's an annual. So there's other milkweeds out there, but for the swamp milkweed, that should return every year for you. There's a tropical Dutchman pipe, and then I can't read. I can't read that question.
It doesn't survive in Illinois, so be careful which one you purchase.
Okay.
Again, I would recommend there is make sure when you're looking to purchase plants, you look at the scientific name, which Martha and I have provided for you, because there are multiple plants that have the same common name, but not the same genus and species. So the scientific name is the given name, so to speak. So that may be yes, you'll have to watch common names on some purchases.
Does swamp milkweed reseed as easily as common? I can only speak from personal experience in the gardens that I've had the swamp milkweed, and I have not experienced any reseeding. I don't know, any of the other educators? Okay, so I guess I would have to say that it's not going to be as reseeding. Oh, okay, so there's someone says that theirs has reseeded. I think it has to do with, you know, the location and, you know, the growing conditions. Oh, okay, thank you. Just saying that the tropical milkweed is not incarnata. Thank you.
Are we ready to turn it over to the next presentation?
If there's no other, let's see. Okay, Kelly, Wild One's website says it reseeds, just needs stratification. Are we talking about the swamp milkweed? Okay, okay, so it just has to have the cold treatment. That's interesting. The tropical milkweed is not good for monarchs in the area. I have to say that they always eat mine down to a stalk. So I've had them and they do very well. Yeah, Phil Nixon says it's one of the best. So, okay, swamp milkweed. Thank you. Okay. Really? That's interesting. Meredith, what part of the state are you living? Because I have not found this at all. Usually it's eaten to the stubs. Up and further, okay. Maybe up north, maybe because of your timing. I have to say they eat mine to the stubs usually by the end of August. Mm-hmm.
We'll continue to monitor the questions and try to respond to those when we get to the end, but I think at this time we'll go ahead and turn it over to Kelly and Ken.
All right. Thank you, Martha and Jennifer. My name is Ken Johnson. I'm also a horticulture educator. I'm located in Jacksonville. And Kelly Alsop and I, she is in Bloomington. We're going to be doing this final presentation on pollinator plants. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of pollination in general, as well as some plants that we've picked out that we think are good for supporting populations of pollinators. So if you've been listening to the news at all, pollinators have kind of become a big topic lately for the last few years, whether it's honeybees, native bees, monarchs. We've been talking about that a little bit. The list kind of goes on and on. And there's a number of different reasons those populations have been declining. It could be habitat loss, diseases building up in the populations. Some say climate change, pesticide misuse. A bunch of different factors are going into that. So why should we really even be concerned about pollination? Many of the plants that we grow cannot reproduce without the help of pollinators. About 75% of all plants are pollinated by animals, and over 90% of flowering plants or angiosperms are actually pollinated by animals. And these plants that are pollinated by these pollinators not only provide food for humans, but as well as wildlife, such as migrating birds and stuff like that. And about a third of our food supply depends on some kind of pollinator or plant interactions, and that's about over 150 different kinds of food in the United States is actually pollinated by pollinators. This is stuff like apples, peaches, pumpkins, sunflowers. In that picture on the left there, we've got a honeybee pollinating some raspberry. There's many different kinds of insects and other animals that will pollinate. They include what we typically think of: bees, butterflies, some moths, wasps, as well as beetles, flies, birds, and a few bats. Birds and bats not so much in the Midwest. Those are more tropical areas, but they will also pollinate some types of plants. So let's talk about a little bit about what pollinators are kind of getting out of pollinating different plants. The first thing that they're going to be going after is the nectar, and this is a sweet liquid made from special glands called nectaries. These are found at the base of flowering plants. Excuse me. And this is the reward that is given to insects and small animals for their help with pollination. So the plants will kind of draw them in with this nectar and then transfer their pollen to them. And for those of you that eat honey, nectar is the base ingredient for that. And then, is everybody seeing the presentation okay? We've had a few people are having issues. Looks good. All right, and the next thing some insects will go after is the pollen. And pollen are dust-like grains that are unique to each type of flowering plant species. So in this picture on the top right, we've got an image of a bunch of different pollen granules. Each one of those different colors is a different species of plant. And the pollen develops within the anther, which is part of the male reproductive structure. You can see that in the picture on the middle there on the right-hand side. And pollen consists of protein, starch, sugars, fats, minerals, vitamins, amino acids, all kinds of good stuff for insects to eat. As a food source for many of our pollinators, bees, beetles and stuff particularly will eat quite a bit of pollen. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the pollinator syndromes, and these are different traits that flowers will take on that kind of will indicate what type of animal will pollinate these flowers. And different types of pollinators. From this table you can see different types of pollinators are attracted to different types of flowers. And this is just kind of a generalization. It's not really set in stone. So just because a flower has a particular trait, say attract bees or something like that, that doesn't mean butterflies or beetles will also visit the flower. And we'll go into a little more detail on these in the coming slides. So the first group we'll talk about is the beetles. This is a group of insects that people don't typically think of as pollinators. The flowers they are attracted to are generally white and green. They don't have any nectar guides, and we'll talk a little bit more about nectar guides when we get into bees and stuff. The odor of the flowers, either no smell or they can be strongly fruity or foul. Sometimes nectar will be present, sometimes it won't. Most of the time beetles are after pollen, so these flowers tend to have ample amounts of pollen. And these flowers are large, bowl-shaped, like the pawpaw up in the top right corner, or they're small and clustered, like the picture in the bottom right with the soldier beetle. And beetles are pretty messy pollinators. They're often referred to as mess and soil pollinators because they'll eat the flower petals and defecate in the flowers, so they kind of make a mess out of the flowers they're pollinating, but they are still pollinating them. And some native examples of plants that are pollinated by beetles are cucumber tree, sweet shrub, and pawpaw. Next up is flies, and this is another group that tends to get overlooked a lot when it comes to pollinators. An example of this would be the syrphid flies or hoverflies. You can see one of those in the top right. And those are actually also make excellent natural enemies. The larval stage will eat aphids and a lot of other soft-bodied insects. These flowers tend to be pale or dark brown in color or purple. And as you can see in that top right picture, there are exceptions to every rule. No nectar guides again. Putrid smell, kind of like rotting meat, stuff like that. They're trying to draw the flies in. They're attracted to that smell. Nectar is usually absent, limited amount of pollen. And the flowers are either shallow funnel-like or they have a complex trap. And some native plants that are pollinated by flies are jack-in-the-pulpit or trillium, and that is trillium in the bottom right corner over there. Usually when you talk about pollinators, first thing people think of are bees. And bees are attracted to flowers that are bright white, yellow, blue, or UV, or ultraviolet in color. They do have nectar guides are present. And you can see the picture on the left there, you've got a flower under normal light. That's the yellow flower, and then on the right is under UV light, and that dark area is actually the nectar guide. That's kind of drawing the bee into the nectaries. And again, on the foxglove on the right there, the spots on the bottom petals, those also act as nectar guides for the bees. These will have a fresh, mild, pleasant smell, so a lot of the plants we plant in our garden that we pick because they smell good are also going to be attractive to bees. Nectar is usually present because the bees are going to take that to make their honey. Pollen tends to be limited, and it's often sticky and scented, so it will stick to the bees. And the flowers tend to be shallow with a landing platform for the bees to land on, or they're tubular in shape. And it's important to remember that there's a lot more bees out there than just honeybees. There's a lot of native bees. In the top there, we've got a bumblebee and a leafcutter bee. And a lot of our native bees are solitary bees. So when you think of bees, keep in mind all of our solitary bees. There's more to bees than just honeybees.
Yeah.
All right, next up are moths. And since most moths are nocturnal, these flowers tend to release a strong, sweet smell at night. A lot of these will also open at night or remain open during the night. The colors tend to be a pale red, purple, pink, or white. There is ample nectar, but it's deeply hidden within the flower. And you can see in these pictures a lot of moths, like this hawk moth, will have really long tongues, and they will hover by the flower and stick that tongue down into the flower. There's limited pollen, and the flower shape is a regular, kind of your typical flower shape, or tubular without a lip, because they don't typically land on these, so they don't need anywhere to land. And the last group we'll talk about here is butterflies. These flowers tend to be bright red and purple. They will also have nectar guides sometimes. The odor tends to be faint and fresh, so again, a lot of the plants we plant in our gardens are attractive to butterflies. Like flowers that moths go to, these will also have a lot of nectar, and it's deeply hidden because, again, butterflies will have long tongues that they can stick down into the flower to get to that nectar. Flowers tend to be narrow tube with a spur or have a wide landing pad. Butterflies will land when they feed, so they need something to land on. So that kind of wraps up our pollinator syndromes. So before we go into the different types of plants that we picked out, we're just going to go through some pollinator garden tips real quick. So when you're putting together a pollinator garden, you want to plant in clumps rather than single plants. That's going to be more attractive to pollinators. They're going to be able to find them a little easier if they're in groups. Use native perennials rather than garden cultivars. While the garden cultivars are pretty to us, oftentimes they've been bred and they don't produce nearly as much pollen or nectar as our native varieties do. You want to plant 3 different types of flowers per season, so you want to have flowers blooming throughout the growing season, and you want to have different types to give the different pollinators options of different plants to go to. You also want to make sure you provide habitat for nesting and egg laying, so stuff like shrubs, tall grasses, low-growing plants, brush piles, places for them to hang out at night, and as well as lay their eggs, raise their young. Small patches of bare ground. These are good for our ground nesting native bees. There's quite a few of those. About 70% of our native bees are ground nesting. You want to provide some protection for wind. Just like people, insects don't like getting blown all over the place. So if you have some wind protection, they will appreciate that. You want to allow for an untidy garden. Like I mentioned with the beetles, they'll tear up flowers. If you are attracting butterflies, there's a chance they're going to lay eggs and have caterpillars. Same with moths. So you're gonna need to allow for some damage to your plants if you're going to be having a good pollinator garden. You also want to leave dead tree trunks in your landscape. This would be good for wood nesting bees as well as beetles. Provide an area for them to lay their eggs and raise their young. And also a good idea to watch your garden, keep a journal so you can kind of keep track of what's out there, and you can kind of tweak the plants you provide based on what is showing up in your garden. Keep notes of what plants do well, what plants don't, stuff like that. So before Callie starts, we've got a little key on our plants that we've picked. So each of those plants will have a little some pictures along with them. A picture of a beetle, a fly, a butterfly, a moth, a bee, a bird, or a caterpillar. And if these will correspond to what types of pollinators they attract, or whether or not they are a larval host for different caterpillar or moths, or moth or butterflies. So with that, I will turn things over to Kelly.
Okay, thank you very much. Am I on?
You are on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Yes, I wanted today to talk about a few of our favorite plants that will attract pollinators and some of the pollinators that they attract. Again, these are just some plants that we picked out. These aren't, the only ones that will attract pollinators, and we just tried to pick out some that attracted many of them. And we wanted to also address many seasons. So you notice we'll start off with some spring ones, then we'll have a few summer ones, and then we'll end off with some fall perennials. This first one is wild columbine, and many of you already have this in your garden, but this wild columbine is the only native species in Illinois. It is grown in the shade. It is about 1 to 3 feet. It blooms late in the spring to early summer. It has these red-yellow blooms with these nectar spurs. It prefers the shade and the partial shade, like I said, but sometimes it can lose its appearance after flowering. Some of the pollinators that are attracted to this plant are butterflies, moths, bumblebees, and then the ruby-throated hummingbird is very attracted to wild columbine. Also, bumblebees will collect the pollen from this plant to feed their larvae. And if you know anything about bees, bumblebees is another one that is a social bee like the honeybee. And when they feed their larvae, they'll feed their larvae a combination of nectar and pollen. So the pollen is important too. And this next plant, I'm going to say this a lot, but I think this is one of my favorite perennials because it has this beautiful arching habit. It stays nice and compact, and then it has beautiful flowers throughout the late spring to early summer. These flower spikes can come in blue and white. They form green pods that turn black and split open, which actually has an ornamental quality. This one's full sun, drought tolerant, and a very long-lived perennial. However, it can be slow to establish and unable to compete with more aggressive plants, which really means you need to keep up on the weeding with this. And that would be very important during establishment, and you wouldn't want to plant it with other a more aggressive next to a more aggressive plant. Right here I have a picture of an orange sulfur, and this plant is very important to the larva of an orange sulfur. They eat plants in this family, and the larval source eats plants in this family. Another thing is blue wild indigo will attract our queen bumblebees, and the wild white one will attract worker bumblebees for nectar. Again, a very beautiful plant. Another one is prairie sundrops. This also is late spring, early summer bloomer. It has these really large yellow petals with these showy floral parts on a fuzzy stem. This is one that, am I miss? Okay. This is full sun. It actually requires moist conditions. However, adding a little bit of organic matter can do your garden wonders as far as keeping in some of that moisture. Sometimes, like the columbine, the appearance may diminish a little after flowering, and then this one can also be somewhat aggressive. And so when you have an aggressive plant, you'd like to plant them in a location where they won't be competing with other non-aggressive plants, or maybe in its own bed that's contained by a sidewalk or grass. The flowers are pollinated primarily by long-tongued bees like our little carpenter bees, butterflies, skippers, and moths. The next plant is Anise hyssop. Now this is one of the most underutilized plants that I personally think in the landscape, and it really should be used more often. And the reason why is because you will have blooms for such a long period of time. It flowers mid to late summer. It produces these beautiful blue-violet spikes. This is one of those plants that can be planted in full to partial sun. When I say partial sun, I mean it has to have the afternoon sun. The flowers are pollinated primarily by honeybees, bumblebees, other native bees. Other occasional visitors will be the Hoover fly that Ken talked about earlier, and bee flies. And also you see on the side, beetles can also pollinate this plant. Purple coneflower. Now, this I would really am wanting to take you more towards pale coneflower, because this one is native and it blooms a little bit earlier than your purple coneflower that you normally find in the industry. It blooms from June to August. It produces these beautiful daisy-like flowers. The seeds head turn really dark, and I actually think the seed heads can be really quite ornamental, and when they remain on the plant, they actually are food for birds like the eastern goldfinch. This one's a full sun to part sun. When I mean by part sun, again, that would be afternoon sun. It prefers well-drained soil and can be very drought tolerant once established. However, in the drought of 2012, I even saw coneflowers wilting. This one, you see a beautiful black swallowtail on it, and then the next picture we see a painted lady butterfly. And honeybees, bumblebees, and the other bees. Your butterfly visitors include monarchs, painted ladies, swallowtails, sulfurs, and whites. And some of the caterpillars of sun butterflies and moths actually use as a larval host. This is the Asclepias milkweed, and this is the most common one, and this is the one that most people have in their landscape.
I have it now.
Okay. I personally don't, I think the common milkweed can be very beneficial if that's what you're trying to grow, but I do think that the butterfly weed and the swamp milkweed is much more ornamental, nice and compact and kind of neat looking, a better garden plant than the common milkweed. This one, blooms early to midsummer, and it can bloom again in the late summer to early fall. They have these beautiful, large, umbel-shaped flowers of orange petals. They also produce a large green seed pod that turns dark as they mature. Once they start splitting open, this is actually when you can gather seed, but know that when you are planting milkweed seeds, they need that stratification, meaning a cold treatment before the seeds will germinate. So what I tell gardeners is either plant in the fall, or you can put the seeds in a wet paper towel for at least 6 weeks in your refrigerator, and that will probably stratify the seeds enough to germinate. This one is full sun, drought tolerant. It forms a large taproot, which would actually make it difficult to transplant. And then some people experienced frost heaving, which means the roots will expose. And one way to prevent this is just mulching around it in the fall. It can also be somewhat slow to establish, so a weeding and a little care in the beginning would be ideal. The stems have milky sap, and that is what monarchs, the larvae of monarchs, eat. So they so that makes them poisonous, so they're not eaten by birds. So just so you know, when you're working in the garden, some people have some allergies to this milky sap. You see right here, I knew you guys would know that this one is pollinated by butterflies. We put a nice moth up here. This is the yellow-colored scape moth. And this, it's actually pictured on Eupatorium bone set, but it also is very attracted to this plant. The flower nectar attracts honeybees, other bees, wasps, butterflies, not just monarchs, but swallowtails and other ones also. And then the ruby-throated hummingbird really enjoys this plant. Again, you see the larval, the caterpillar representing this as a larval plant. Now, one of my favorite things about planting milkweed is that when you plant milkweed, you're planting for more than just monarchs. There are so many different pollinators and invertebrates, insects that survive on this plant. We're going to go to Liatris. And this is called Prairie Blazing Star. If you don't have this plant in your garden, you are definitely missing out on a beautiful mid to late summer bloomer. It has these really erect, large pink to purple spikes. They turn into these achenes that look like little brown tufts, and they're dispersed by the wind. It's a full sun plant. However, as far as growing, this one needs a little care in the beginning because it will not tolerate drought. The pollinators that are attracted to this one would be bee flies or day-flying moths, bumblebees. We have our different other bees like carpenter and leafcutter bee. And then again, this one's very attracted to monarchs. And then the caterpillars of a rare glorious flower moth actually feed on the flowers and seed capsules of this plant. You see here, this is Eupatorium. Now, this is related to Joe Pyeweed. It's in the same genus, but this is just a little bit different. It's much shorter, 2 to 4 feet. It blooms late summer to early fall. It has these large spreading heads of clustered white disc flowers. The flowers will form into achenes and are dispersed by the wind. This one's full sun to part sun. It likes moist conditions, and it can actually withstand a little flooding. So if you have a wet spot in your yard, this one would be perfect. The nectar and the pollen of the flowers are attracted to many kinds of insects, including bees, flies, wasps, butterflies, beetles. You see here, that's the goldenrod soldier beetle on a white flower. And the caterpillars of various moth species are known to feed on this plant. Another one I wanted to talk about is everyone likes to grow sunflowers, but we do have a perennial sunflower, and sunflowers are amazing for lepidopteras. When I say that, I mean butterflies and moths. And this one blooms in the late summer to early fall. It has this large, beautiful, spreading flower head. And of these composite flowers of bright yellow. And then it has this fuzzy gray foliage. So really nice contrast. Full sun, dry conditions. This one forms dense colonies. And when Jennifer said earlier that the bush honeysuckle had allelopathic tendencies, so does this one. An example of allelopathic tendencies would be walnut, meaning the roots actually emit a chemical that doesn't allow other plant species to grow around it. So really, if it's a very aggressive plant, then you might want to put it in a location where it's not going to get out of control, block it off by sidewalks or grass, and then you don't really have to water or fertilize it because it'll do just fine. This one's primarily visited by bees, flowers, nectar, primarily visited by bees. Some other occasional visitors of the flower can include bee flies and butterflies. And then the caterpillars of silvery checker spot and gorgon checker spot butterflies feed on the foliage. I know Jennifer and Martha talked about cardinal flower, and we wanted to talk about it also. And the reason why we wanted to talk about it also was because it is just such a great late summer to early fall bloomer. And if both of us talk about it, then obviously it's the plant that we need to be planting. Beautiful red flowers. You look at it in the right picture. This is a picture by Doug Tallamy. Just stunningly gorgeous red flowers. They produce small seeds that are dispersed by wind. This one will actually take a little bit of light shade to full sun. So when I mean light shade, I mean that morning sun is enough to get nice blooms on this. Moist conditions, like Martha said. This one also can be difficult to transplant because of a taproot, and it can be a little short-lived. So what I mean by short-lived is maybe it'll live for 5 or 6 years, and the appearance will diminish and you'll have to replant it. But definitely worth it. Every single pollinator garden I've ever seen or butterfly in my life has included this amazing plant. You see here, ruby-throated hummingbirds absolutely adore this plant. And also various swallowtail butterflies. And then a really interesting thing is sometimes the larger bumblebees will actually tear apart the flower to steal the nectar. Quite interesting. And then also we have the larvae of some flies and moths actually use this plant as a larval host. So I'm done with my plant list. Obviously, I could probably talk for hours of how many plants that I'd love for you to put in your garden and that would attract pollinators. But here is, Ken has put together, found two sites that you can visit to where you could actually find native plant nurseries and native plant sources. Because we're telling you to plant natives, so go here and this will help you find where to find those types of things. Additional resources on pollinators, the Xerces Society. This has, been around for a while and has been an advocate of pollinators, just as the Wild Ones group is an advocate of native plants. Illinois Wildflowers, this was a website that was crucial for Ken and I to really look and see what plants really had the best faunal associations, so that was an amazing website. Another thing is we have a pollinatarium here at the University of Illinois, and this is the first freestanding building committed to pollinator education. This is open usually during the growing season every Sunday at 2 o'clock. Amazing for children. They're going to have a pollinator garden there. And then the other Bee Spotter, this is kind of like a citizen scientist effort where you can upload pictures of bees and have an actual entomologist scientist identify those bees for you, because sometimes it can be difficult. With this program, they actually found a bee that was believed to be extinct, and that was the rusty-patched bumblebee. I have a blog called Flowers, Fruits, and Frass. If you don't know what frass means, that means insect poop. I know I got a bit clever there, but I really love walking into the garden and blogging about exactly what I see. And if you can't notice by the pictures on my blog promo, I love insects, especially beneficial insects and pollinators. Do you have any questions for Ken and I?
She worked for them. Livingston, McLean, and Woodland counties.
Yeah. Central Illinois.
I hear you talking about me. I am an educator for Livingston, McLean, and Woodford counties, and so that we serve different units, and all of us together are the central part of Illinois, and we collaborate with some efforts. And I just wanted to go ahead and pull up the last slide and say thank you to all of these people for putting together such a great and meaningful webinar. I know somebody's got a question for me. At least let me say, I don't know. I have to look it up.
We have 116 people that will.
Wow, 116 people. My blog address, if you just went ahead and just typed in flowers, fruits, and frass to Google, you would find my blog right away. Definitely. This is a great way to, think about what plants you're going to plant this summer, this season. And, I know gardeners are always looking for the new best thing. And like Martha said, I love the statement of researching. Go in there with an idea of what kind of garden you want to start. Think about how you might plant some plants for the pollinators. And, you're going to pick out these great plants for them and not just for yourself. And
it says, is it not good to plant other pollinators with the downy something? She would have gotten it all.
Other pollinator plants?
Thank you. Great presentation.
I actually think that many herbs attract pollinators, and the reason is because they're so floriferous. And another thing is, with that, the dill and the fennel and the parsley can be great larval sources of plants. I think herbs are excellent for the garden when it comes to attracting beneficial insects and pollinators.
Holly had a question earlier about native columbine cross-pollinating with non-natives, and they will cross-pollinate with like the European columbines and stuff.
There's a question, is it not good to plant other pollinators with the downy sunflower?
You should be able to. It's probably something more to be aware of, that this can have some allelopathy to it, but you should still be able to plant other stuff around it.
Yes, to add on to that, I have seen it planted with other stuff. Yes, one of the things that I'm commonly concerned with is when you purchase a native plant or something that you are actually purchasing for pollinators, you want to make sure that that plant hasn't been sprayed with chemicals in the growing process. And that is definitely something that you can ask the people who sell. I used to be a grower in a greenhouse, and anybody that asked me, I could tell them what I had sprayed on that plant. And, some people in the industry, we actually give them reports. As far as spraying insecticides, there are a lot of biological pesticides out there that do not necessarily harm pollinators or butterflies or bees. I do think people need to be careful because some pesticides can really make it to where you won't have any pollinator visitors for a while. Would any other educator like to add to that? I know that that is a big issue for horticulturists.
Well, it kind of goes along with you're going to need to accept some plant damage. You can't go out there and spray anytime you see plant damage because you will start affecting your pollinators if you get a little spray happy. So yeah, but there's definitely some softer chemicals that aren't nearly as toxic to some of our beneficials or our natural enemies and stuff.
And what we always tell people is always read and follow the label directions. Your labels will tell you what it's toxic to, so read those carefully. The other thing we recommend, if you do need to use a chemical that may be toxic to some of the pollinators, is to use those later in the afternoon, early evenings when the pollinators aren't as active.
Missouri Wildflowers in Jefferson City. You can definitely get natives from there. We just put those two websites up there. They have a database of different companies and stuff that sell native flowers, so you'll probably be able to find them in one of those databases.
There was a question about the hybrid columbines reverting to the native after a while. They can cross, and it has to do with, if the native is the more dominant trait, yeah, you're going to get more of the natives coming back than your hybrids. So that's what I can only imagine is happening.
Another thing that I always like to add with gardeners is when a gardener will come in, they will say, I have this pest, and I'm always saying, look for the beneficial insects out there. I think a lot of people see the pest, but they don't see the beneficial insects. And most of the time, when you don't spray, beneficial insects will come in and take care of your pest concerns. And it just naturally does that. As far as Monarda, yes, Monarda is a great pollinator plant. Butterflies absolutely love Monarda. Well, okay, if there are no more questions, we definitely thank you for joining us for our webinar. And like I said earlier, we feel like this is definitely something we'd like to educate Illinois on, and thank you for letting us educate you. And please look for more webinars in the future. And again, thank you from University of Illinois Extension.